people see only authentic Cantonese food as the Holy Grail. But is this belief holding it back? Is it now time to be more creative, perhaps in the same way Redzepi, Adria and Blumenthal have been in championing their own national cuisines?
We chatted to Jowett Yu of Holy Fook and Daniel Choi of Seventh Sun, two operators in Hong Kong at the forefront of the Cantonese food renaissance. So Jowett, I want to start with you. You're kind of a product of the new globalized world. You were born in Taiwan, you grew up in North America, and you went to work in Australia. And I think that a lot of foreigners in foreign countries, Chinese food seems to be, people seem to see authentic Chinese food as the holy grail. What do you think? Is that stopping us from being creative with it?
I think Chinese food is awesome. And it's so dynamic, it's so complex, and it's very different everywhere in the world. You can go to Singapore, you can go to Malaysia, you can go to Canada, you can go to Australia. Every country has different versions of Chinese food.
Isn't that a problem though, in that what is a truly unique and original Cantonese flavor rather than having something that's exported and is no real bearing on the reality of what we should be doing?
If you're a chef cooking Chinese food in Africa, for example, you have possibly limited access to a lot of things that you would back in China. Okay. So as a chef, you gotta make sense of your surroundings. Like, okay, how can I interpret Chinese cuisine in a place that with limited supply or limited access to ingredients, and how do I make sense and create a Chinese cuisine that is suited for where the restaurant is?
Okay, so if that's applicable to countries outside of China, in Hong Kong, do you think that Cantonese chefs are doing enough with the ingredients that we have in our own city to say, right, we need to take Cantonese food and set the benchmark of it?
Hong Kong presents a lot of problems for Hong Kong chefs because there's very limited farmland, very limited,
production
facilities.
Yeah.
So you have to rely on importing a lot of stuff from everywhere. And
but surely, if we're at the heart of Chinese and Cantonese cuisine, we should have everything at our disposal.
Yeah. What do you think, Daniel?
Well, come from a background of traditional Cantonese cuisine for over 65 years. We source a lot of our produce from different parts of China, and mainly the Punyu, the Shunde area of China, which is very well renowned for its reputation of Cantonese cuisine. I think, as Joe was saying, Chinese cuisine itself is very complex. It is not just a single cuisine. Even within China, it's at least 8 major cuisine, let alone all different small ethnic minorities groups there too. So I could only represent the Cantonese cuisine that stemmed from my grandfather's tradition.
Do you think that in the face of this tradition, it makes it more difficult for us to innovate? Like, are we bound by traditions a bit too much, or is that the way it should be?
In some way it is, but also it is not. I think coming from my grandfather, my father, and myself now, having studied abroad and come back to Hong Kong, I see even our traditional clients, their palates are actually changing, but they don't change as quickly as we see the world maybe, but they've definitely changed in the past 30 or 50 years due to the economical development, the broadening of education, and also their ability to travel to many different countries. So that has changed that too.
Well, I think as a Chinese person, that Chinese food doesn't seem, or Cantonese food doesn't seem to be well represented enough throughout the world. Not in the way that, we have Chinatowns around the world, sure, but it seems like the domain of takeaway, cheap takeaway food. Are we going to see a change to that anytime soon? Because, I mean, great, we have modern French, we have fine dining Italian. When are we going to see that across the world?
I think it is happening already, as Zhao was saying, and it was actually limited by the method of transportation, refrigeration, and also the acceptance of local culture. But I think that is changing. People become more globalized. And even in my short experience of coming back to Hong Kong, helping with the family business, we're seeing lots of Western people who have seen on internet or magazines or on their plane, on their local satellite TV, have come to our Seven Sun, or previously my father's Fuk Lem Moon, to try very authentic traditional cuisine dishes, specifically requesting for some very authentic cuisine.
And do you think it's the responsibility of the new generation of chefs to set the benchmark of Cantonese cuisine and to say, this is how we see the future, and then get the public to buy into that? Do you think that's the way forward?
Absolutely. It's always a two-way process, the client and the customer. Even from what my father would tell me, the cuisine we develop in Fuk Lem Moon or Seven Sun were always been an evolution along with the customer's palate. We started off a humble family catering and gradually moved into whole formal dining. And then it was only in the 1980s we introduced dim sum and then our own roasting department. It didn't all start right at the beginning like that. It was more separate specialties. Now amalgamating because the customers' requests and demands are different nowadays.
Do you think you work with a lot of Chinese chefs who have learned the classical way? Do you think it's difficult to tell them that customers' palates are changing, or is it difficult to have them update what they do?
It is a challenge. It is a challenge. I think as a proprietor or executive chef, as a leader of the kitchen or the cuisine, you really, yes, as you say, have to communicate with them really well. You need to get them on your side. They understand what you are trying to do, and not just some new person coming to tell us what to do when they've been in the trade for even much longer than we have. Yeah.
And how have you found moving to Hong Kong and working with the local population and the chefs here? Have you found it an easy transition?
There's definitely has its challenges. There's a lot of supplies that I want, and there's difficulties in getting. Also, there's a language barrier. But I'm pretty lucky the team that I have. Some of the local Hong Kong guys, like they're really interested in like my interpretation of Asian food, Chinese food, and yeah, they're curious, you know, and which is good because you've got a lot of chefs just tend to like stay in the kitchen. That's their little world, but there's a whole world beyond out there, you know, and the event of globalization and internet and availability of books, you know, you can know what or Instagram or social media, you can know what other chefs are doing across the world, just with a couple clicks, and that's a good thing, you know. It makes them not only look upon themselves, but to also look at the rest of the world and see what everyone else is doing, and then see how is that you know, that curiosity can transcend into looking into yourself, into your own cooking style.
There has to come a time sometime where people say Hong Kong's in the top 50, but it's in there because there's a Cantonese restaurant in there as well. So Noma is in there, the British are in there, and they're representing their cuisines. Surely we don't want to be only an international city where we have world-class chefs, but it's French cuisine, it's Italian cuisine, it's this sort of stuff. We need to get to a point where we have a good few Cantonese ones in there. Who do you think in Hong Kong is spearheading that, and where do you think we'll go in 5 years?
Well, I think actually in the history of Hong Kong, the gourmets have already been the active voters by actually fishing out the money to pay for the dishes they're having or the banquets they're having as a vote of support in what they see as their top restaurants in Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong people or Chinese people in tradition are a bit more reserved in the way of writing out books and actually giving reviews and comments on people. So that is a more of a Western culture that has been recently brought into Hong Kong, and people have accepted that. But that's why Hong Kong had never had its own version of Michelin or any kind of food guidebook, because that is actually one disadvantage or negative point slightly of the traditional Chinese people is they don't tend to share opinions with other people. But that is changing also. with open rice and all that.
And do you think the younger generation want to hold on to Cantonese cuisine? The sort of the 16 to 25, the new generation of diners that will eventually come through, do you think they hold on to something, or they will have something to hold on to?
I think it is difficult for them as they grew up in a society like Hong Kong, with bombarded with so many different food culture. In the current generation, it's actually very hard for them to identify what is true traditional fine Cantonese cuisine is.
Sorry, but is that important? Because
It is. It is very
I mean,
I
important.
think it's vital, actually.
It's education.
Is that the future of Chinese food, holding on to authentic recipes, or is it something that's constantly evolving and we should embrace that? I mean, Zhao, you're doing something that is your interpretation of Chinese. And it's definitely, I mean, some parts, of course, you hold on to tradition, but in other parts, it's pure creativity. So, I mean, going into the future, which will be Chinese cuisine as the 16-year-olds today will know?
I think there's definitely a time and place for Chinese cuisine, the fine Cantonese classical stuff, that to exist parallel to, you know, something that I do or something that Alvin does. You know, same thing as Italian cooking, Osteria Francescana. You know, what he's doing to Italian cooking is not maybe classically Italian, but it exists parallel to other classic Italian traditions. You have guys like you know, Ferran. What he was doing to Spanish food, starting from like 1998, you know, he was existing parallel to the classic Spanish cuisine, but then he just went on a whole new tangent. And there's definitely a time and place for, you know, embracing tradition and the traditional culture of Cantonese cooking and other Chinese cooking. But I think, you know, you can't stop someone from being creative. You know, it's like growing up in cooking in Australia. I really understood like Australian chefs, because there's a lack of Australian food culture. So there are no boundaries. They just invent their own. So that's you know, you gotta draw a line like, hey, how do you stay traditional but at the same time, you know, be really creative and innovative?
I think there's a scope for being innovative, as long as we don't lose the identity of using our local ingredients, using age-old techniques, and something that people can still say, okay, it's firmly rooted in what Cantonese was supposed to be as a cuisine, and it's become modernized, but it will always still have that DNA. I think if we get to the stage of using foreign imported ingredients and then using certain techniques, maybe it will lose some of it. I mean, Ferran Adrià, he was brilliant in that he brought the spotlight to Spain, but Spanish food is about the simplicity of Spanish food and its ingredients and its heritage and all of those things. So he was just a spotlight for Spain. So if somebody had to say, okay, your generation will shine a spotlight on Cantonese cuisine, who is that going to be on? You know, do we have that yet?
I think it's essential to understand that there's what David Chang has done with Korean cooking, you know, adapting Korean cooking to the clientele in New York.
Sure.
And Roy Choi in LA, doing taco and Korean fusion, you know, and that's great because it's bringing sort of a new spotlight to what an age-old tradition from where they come from and where I come from. You know, it certainly brings a spotlight like, okay, let's look at the existing market of Chinese food, but how can we change that? How can we not necessarily change, but there's definitely a room for you know, different parallels within Chinese cooking. Sure. And just living in Hong Kong, you know, the influx of foreign culture has really influenced the way people in Hong Kong eat. You go to a cha-chang tang, you can have like French toast and you know, macaroni, and you have char siu fan. You can have all that in one restaurant.
And it's all relevant.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that is, I mean, if I ask my staff, like, what do you have for breakfast? They have macaroni and spam for breakfast, you know? And where did that come from? That didn't exist in Chinese cooking 100 years ago, you know? So this constant flux of culture is shaping the way people eat, not only in the past, not only now, but also in the future.
Certainly is some thing to think about in the future. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been
Thank
an
you.
absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
And that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much.